Welcome to Module 4. The primary focus here will be on traditional/tribal healing. And in this first module, we're going to discuss chapters 1 and 8 in your Kinsley book. There will also be another module on shamanism, and then finally a third module on exorcism. But in this Module 4, Part 1, we're going to focus on Kinsley Chapter 1, which is Theories of Disease and Types of Healers, and Kinsley Chapter 8, Central Themes in Traditional Healing. Start us off here in our discussion of traditional tribal healing. Okay, well, Chapter 1 first. People in traditional societies view the world as being literally filled with spirits of all different types. Also, too, some people in traditional tribal indigenous societies believe that things such as seas and mountains and lakes, trees, plants, animals, and so forth are spiritually animated. That belief is known as animism, the idea that virtually all things around us are animated by some sort of spiritual force. So the world is, for many tribal, indigenous, traditional peoples, is literally alive with spirits and spiritual influences. And it's also important to remember that in many cases they have no word for the supernatural, since it's thought to be part of the world we live in. So the supernatural and the natural are one and the same, whereas we strictly delineate between the two. Many traditional tribal indigenous peoples do not. So sickness, then, tribal societies occurs in this context. And we need to keep this in mind. And it's thought that it's important that the individual maintain a harmonious relationship with the spirit world. You don't want to be disrespectful to the spirits. You don't want to insult the spirits. You want to offer the proper sacrifices for them, do the proper rituals, etc. Another important aspect of traditional tribal indigenous sickness is that sickness is often framed in a moral context. So, for example, what we might call sinful behavior in the West is thought to actually lead to sickness in traditional tribal indigenous societies. Now, a while ago I mentioned disharmonious relationships with the spirits is avoided. So what sort of spirits are we talking about here? Well, we have deities, or what we would customarily refer to as gods. And here we're thinking along the lines of some sort of divine punishment. Often there will be certain spirits who have a very specific purview. For example, in the Orisha religion I study in Trinidad, the god Shakpana actually controls smallpox and other sickness. Also, too, there was the Black Death plague of the 14th century in Asia and Europe that at that point in time was widely attributed to immoral behavior on the part of humans, deserving of punishment at the hands of God. And some people, in fact, even invoke the so-called quote-unquote penal interpretation of punishment in regard to Hurricane Katrina. Although that's frankly silly, nevertheless, it was done. So anyway, so one certainly wants to maintain a harmonious relationship with the deities, with the gods. Then there's also ancestors and ghosts. The ancestors in traditional tribal indigenous societies are thought to be very active in this world. Even though they may have quote-unquote passed over to another plane of existence, remember, there is no natural and supernatural distinction made. So they're still a very active part of this world, and they must be appeased. They must be respected. In fact, no important decisions are made. For example, the buying of land or family decisions or political decisions, none of these decisions are made without going to the ancestors first. And it's certainly thought that inimical and unhappy spirits or ghosts can really cause problems. I guess we have that sort of idea here in the West, at least some of us do, anyway. And then, so after the gods, ancestors, or ghosts, we have a third category, and that's other human beings. You must maintain a harmonious relationship with other human beings. The idea here is that if you invoke anger or hate on the part of someone else, you can actually be harmed because of that. And I'm thinking here of things such as the evil eye. The evil eye, which is widely thought to be a cause of sickness. There's also sorcery. There's also witchcraft. So other human beings can be a source of sickness. Kinsley also discusses what he calls theories of disease causation. In other words, what precisely is it that is making people sick? What are the immediate causes of sickness? Well, he discusses 5. First, there's soul loss. Soul loss. Since it's thought that the physical body is animated by the soul, if the soul is not present, or if it is weak, then that could eventually certainly cause sickness and may eventually cause even death as well. Cysto is a culture-bound syndrome found in Central America that's attributed to soul loss. It's interesting to note that in many native explanations of spirit possession, it is said that when the animating spirit leaves the individual, the one that's doing the possessing, they'll simply collapse unconscious. And they'll be out for a while until their spirit returns and they eventually come to regain consciousness. Of course, their explanation is that a spirit of some sort is needed in the body to animate it. Otherwise, it will eventually die. Okay, soul loss was the first immediate cause of sickness. Secondly, we have object intrusion. Object intrusion. Many traditional tribal and indigenous societies believe that, for example, invisible projectiles can be shot into someone, making them sick. You're going to read about that when you read The Sound of Rushing Water, about shamanism among the Hivro of Ecuador. They have something called the tsinsak, which is little magic darts that the shamans shoot into people to make them sick. You're also going to read about the lobir in the Book of Water and the Spirits, that are invisible projectiles that people, that at least some warriors are thought to be able to shoot into people and kill them. All right, thirdly, we have spirit intrusion. The third immediate cause of sickness is spirit intrusion. Of course, in Western terms, we would simply refer to that as spirit possession. And certainly most of you know enough about spirit possession to know that it can lead to sickness. At least that is the, let us say, the emic interpretation. Anthropology does not subscribe. In fact, anthropology, like modern psychiatry and psychology, does not subscribe to the theory that spirits can inhabit human beings. Nevertheless, we're talking about an ethnomedical idea here, popular in the traditional world, that in fact spirits can invade people's bodies and be a cause of sickness. Fourth, disease sorcery. It's thought that a sorcerer, and by the way, in anthropology, sorcery is magic done with the intent to harm. Magic done with the intent to harm. So it's thought that a sorcerer can actually transmit his or her power, usually his power, to another person. Think, for example, about voodoo death, where a sorcerer can actually point a bone at someone, thereby putting a death hex on them. So sorcery is an immediate cause of sickness. And then finally, number 5, breach of a taboo. Breach of a taboo. If you do something that you should not do, you may be inadvertently insulting either the ancestors or the gods, and the result will be perhaps death or maybe sickness. Now, Kinsley notes that these mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. In other words, they may certainly work together in some cases. All right, finally in Chapter 1, Kinsley discusses types of healers. First, he discusses shamans. We're going to have a separate module on shamans, so I'm not going to say anything more about them now other than that shamans are the oldest form of what we would call medical practitioner known to anthropologists. It's the most ancient form of healer. And they're thought to have the ability to actually travel to the spirit world, or certainly at least have an audience with the spirits. And that's what makes them unique in the world of healers. More about them in a later module. Another type of healer is a spirit medium. I think we're somewhat familiar with that here in the West. Think of the seance, as also the term channeling comes to mind, whereby an individual actually serves as the vessel for a spirit. And that spirit will manifest itself, of course, in the form of that person, and thereby consult with sick people, actually heal by the laying on of hands or whatever. But the important point is that the spirit has actually entered our world in the form of another human being. So the spirit is right here in front of us. And so healing may be accomplished in that way. There's also the priest. The priest will generally use ritual. Now, don't think of Catholic priest or an Episcopalian priest. Just think of the general term priest, which is used for anyone who engages in rituals or the reading of text for religious or healing purposes. And these individuals have the ability to at least appease the spirits and bring petitions to the spirits. And they will conduct proper rituals in order to encourage the gods and spirits to bring about healing. We also have what Kinsley refers to as the holy person. In our culture, we refer to these as faith healers, and you have similar types of healers in cultures worldwide. So the holy person, the person themselves, is thought to have some sort of healing power. And then finally, there's the prescriptionist. The prescriptionist is a person who prepares medicines from plants and herbs and minerals and so forth. Okay, Chapter 8, Central Themes in Traditional Healing. Just a few words on some of the important things covered here in Chapter 8. Confession, as you'll read in Chapter 8, is an important part of healing, according to many traditional societies. And often something like a public confession is called for. For example, refer to the Ihamba. That would be on page 72, where it says, "It is said that the Ihamba will not come out or allow itself to be extracted by the healer unless the patient's kin have confessed all their wrongdoings. The patient must also confess his grudges and complaints against others if he is to become free of the ancestral bite." So we're talking about a coming together of the community and airing grievances. An interesting characteristic of ethnomedical healing. So clearly, at least in regard to that idea, we see a strong mechanism of social control at work. Because after all, who wants to publicly admit something embarrassing or shameful or illegal? And so therefore it's a form of social control. So healing is social control. There are other aspects of medicine that also function as social control mechanisms. For example, witchcraft in North Central Africa, where if there is some misfortune that befalls someone and witchcraft is suspected, well, a quote-unquote short list is quickly put together and people are put to the test. But again, who wants to be publicly shamed as being a witch? So hence the social control. Also, the bone-pointing sorcery or the voodoo death we spoke of among the Australian Aborigines. It is only someone who has egregiously transgressed some custom, some social moray, or whatever that is subject to this sort of punishment. And then in The Serpent and the Rainbow, Wade Davis discusses the Bazongo secret society in Haiti, where in fact people are held responsible for various forms of social and cultural misbehavior. Otherwise, they will be subject to some sort of sickness as a result of being zombified to one degree or another. Okay, next Kinsley discusses transference. Transference. The idea behind transference is that it is thought that people can actually take the sickness out of someone and put it in some object and then destroy the object, thereby destroying the sickness. Sometimes there may be a two-way transferal of energy, so to speak, sickness and healing energy. Consider the Kung Bushman, for example, whereby the healing energy is transferred from the shaman to the patient, and the patient's sickness is transferred back to the shaman. You're also going to read about sweeping, where a person will take an egg. This is done in Central America, in Southwest United States, in Latin cultures. They'll take an egg and sweep it over the body, thereby sucking the sickness out, quote unquote, into the egg and then destroying the egg. In Trinidad, after a sick person is exorcised, they will then take that spirit and trap it in a bottle and then push the bottle top down into the ground, thereby trapping the spirit. So another form of transference. Kinsley also discusses sacred spaces and healing context in this chapter. Sometimes there will be a special place designated for healing, but often, in fact, more commonly, a secular place, in other words, any place, can be transformed into a place for healing. And you'll read about that in the chapter. Effective healers. Effective healers is something that's discussed by Kinsley in this chapter. Healers in traditional societies are often appointed by consensus, since there's really no formal mechanism whereby a person becomes a healer. So naturally, think about it, those people who are healers are usually very wise, very intelligent, very schooled in the ways of their culture, probably very charismatic, great speakers, great storytellers. And these will often be the people who are healers. In Trinidad, where I do my work, the most effective healers are those who have the greatest knowledge of their religion and all the various spirits. Because after all, think about it, before healing takes place, a lot of which is psychotherapeutic, then the patient has to have a lot of confidence in the ability of the healers. There's a concept referred to as wounded healers. These are people who themselves have come through a traumatic illness and then go on to be healers themselves. Also, too, the intersexed and transgendered are thought to have special powers, and many of them will be shamans. One other point here that I alluded to a while ago, it's very important in ethnomedical healing that the healer and the patient both share worldviews and both have a lot of confidence in the fact that that worldview is, in fact, true. Otherwise, think of the implications for psychotherapeutic healing, for things such as the placebo effect, for example. Without confidence, there is no placebo effect. Without confidence in the priest or the shaman and the rituals and the chants and all the other trappings, exorcism, for example, is not going to be successful. And it is, ironically enough, in every culture around the world. Exorcism works. Anthropologists believe that's because of psychotherapeutic reasons, but nevertheless, that does not happen without the confidence that both the healers and the patients have in the medical system. And finally, the culture-specific nature of illness is discussed a little bit by Kinsley. Here, actually on page 80, Kinsley seems to argue that the concept of culture-bound sickness is a valid one, whereas Hahn does not agree with that, as you know. We covered that a couple of modules ago. But anyway, read for yourself and see what you think. It appears as though Kinsley is arguing that the concept of a culture-bound sickness is a valid one. Here he talks a little bit about Koro, a very interesting malady that you find in China, in northern Africa, and other places. It's generally called the fear of the shrinking penis, or fear of actually losing the penis. In China, they believe that they need to reestablish the natural balance between the yin and the yang, the so-called sort of male and feminine aspects of human nature. There's also cysto. We talked about that a little bit earlier. It's discussed here. And then finally, there's a concluding quote on page 82 that I'd like to read for you real quick. The importance of confession, often public, also implicates the wider community as important in the healing process. It is clear in many cases that illness is directly related to interpersonal relationships and that the healing process must include confession and forgiveness among members of a community. In this role, many traditional healers play the role of confessor, priest, and counselor. They act to restore group solidarity and harmony. As healers, their main role often is to facilitate rapprochement between alienated members of a family or community. And here we see what I mean when I refer to ethnomedicine as being culturally organic. There's a lot more going on here than making cells healthy again. There's the healing of the community, the healing of souls, etc.